You know how people talk about a house settling? Like it's just the wood and the stone making noise as it gets old? Shifting in the foundation, making a little creak in the dead of night. That's what people say to make themselves feel better. Well, I grew up in a house that wasn't settling. It was breathing. And I didn't realize it, didn't understand the awful cold truth of it until I was a grown-up, standing right back where I started. This isn't a ghost story. There was no old lady in a nightgown, no shadowy figure floating down the hall. This is about the house itself, the very walls, the foundation, the dirt it was built on, the brick, the mortar, every piece of lumber hammered into place. It was alive. And for years, I just thought the noises were normal. Everyone's old house groans, right? You get used to the sounds of your home. They become part of the air. You breathe inside of it. But the day I finally realized the truth, the day I heard a deep, rattling inhale that was too slow, too wet, and too perfectly timed to be anything else, that's when everything I thought I knew about the world and about being safe broke into a million pieces. And I'm telling you this now because I need to make sense of what I left behind. My childhood home wasn't special looking at all. If you drove past it today, you wouldn't slow down. It was a standard two-story colonial, the kind you see on any street in the suburbs. It had faded yellow siding, the color of old butter, and a porch that always slanted just a little to the right, mostly because the ground underneath it was probably shifting slowly over the years. We had a big, ancient maple tree in the front yard, the roots of which had cracked the sidewalk in a couple of places. And that was about it. A normal house, on a normal street, in a normal town. Nothing to see here, except for the noises. Every kid hears stuff in their house at night. You know the drill. It's the pipes rattling, it's the wind outside making the windows hum like a big, sad bottle. It's the heater kicking on with a sudden, clanging sound that makes you jump out of your skin. You tell yourself it's just the house. You learn to tune it out. We all did that. But the sound in my house, it was always different. It wasn't a sudden noise. It was the background noise of my entire life. The subtle, constant rhythm underneath everything else. It was a low, heavy, thump, thump sound that never quite stopped. When I was little, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I'd lie in bed, clutching my superhero blanket, and I would hear it. It wasn't loud enough to wake up my parents, but it was loud enough to fill the complete silence of my room. A low, dull, almost gentle thrumming sound. It felt like a giant, slow heartbeat buried deep in the earth beneath the foundation. It was predictable. It was always there. It was comforting in a strange, primal way. I remember thinking of it like the house was singing a quiet, droning lullaby just for me. It was the only house I'd ever known, so that sound was just there. It was as normal as the smell of the dusty attic on a hot day, or the rough, scratchy carpet on the stairs. It was just the house, being my safe place. We were trained to ignore it. If the TV was on, you couldn't hear it. If my mom was cooking dinner, the clatter of the pans covered it up. If my dad was working in the garage, the sound of his tools drowned it out. It was a sound that only existed in the true, heavy quiet. You had to be waiting for it to hear it. And as a kid, I was usually trying to fall asleep, so I was always waiting. I would focus on the sound, trying to feel it travel up through the mattress and into my bones. It felt like a low-frequency hum, the kind of sound that you feel more than you hear. But I was wrong. I was so completely wrong. It wasn't until I moved away for college, spent 4 years in a loud, cramped apartment building, and then later came back for a few months after I graduated, that I realized how terrible my mistake had been. You spend years away, living a different life, and you come back and suddenly you're a total tourist in your own history. You see things that you completely missed before, things your brain had filtered out just to keep you sane. I was 22, freshly moved back into my old bedroom, trying to save money before starting my first big job. The house felt smaller, colder, and suddenly the noises weren't comforting anymore. They were loud. Maybe my adult ears were more sensitive after living in the city, or maybe the house itself was just getting older, making its internal workings more noticeable. The pipes groaned, the wood cracked in the attic, and the wind howled down the chimney. All of it was normal house stuff. But then there was that sound, the one I'd forgotten about until I was lying in my old bed on the first night back, staring at the ceiling and smelling the familiar scent of old wood and dust. The low, deep, rhythmic thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. Came from somewhere deep inside the structure. It was slow. Too slow for a normal heartbeat, I realize now. Too slow for a water pump. I lay there that night, just listening, trying to place it. Where was the noise coming from? I tried to be analytical, to use my grown-up logic. Is it the refrigerator motor cycling on and off in the kitchen downstairs? No, that was a constant high-pitched hum. Is it the furnace? No, the furnace made a rushing air sound through the vents. This was a percussion sound, a deep, heavy impact, but muffled, as if it was coming from something massive and soft. I got up, walked out into the hall, and put my ear against the wall. Nothing. I went downstairs and pressed my ear against the plaster in the living room. Still nothing. I went to the kitchen and checked the fridge. Normal humming. Nothing to see there. I went back to bed, frustrated. I was convinced I was just going crazy from the stress of being home again, or maybe just from the overwhelming quiet. I told myself again and again, it's just an old house. Old houses make noise. That was my expectation, and I was desperate for reality to match it. But the reality was about to start beating that expectation into 1,000 tiny pieces of absolute terror. The noises got much worse over the next few weeks, or maybe I just became incapable of ignoring them again. It was always in the dead of night, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., when the neighborhood was absolutely silent, when the world outside felt like it was holding its breath. That was when the rhythm started. It felt like it was coming from the very center of the house, maybe the basement or the crawl space below the main floor. I started to notice something strange about it, something that turned the background noise into a terrifying mechanical pattern. The sound wasn't just a thump-thump, it was a thump-thump, pause, then a long, drawn-out, wet, almost scraping sound, followed by a slight shift, and then another long pause, and then the next thump-thump. It was too much like a cycle, a physical, living process. It had an inhale and an exhale. The first time I really heard it, the moment that made the hair stand up on my arms and the little hairs on the back of my neck feel like static electricity, I was sitting up in bed trying to read an old paperback. The house was quiet. My parents were asleep down the hall. Everything was still. Then the familiar thump-thump started, very low,
resonating through the wood. I waited. I was waiting for the pipes to rattle, for the wind to pick up, for some normal, logical house noise to explain it away and let me get back to my book. But all I got was the thump-thump, and then a profound, heavy silence that felt like pressure. And then it came. It was a sound that made the air in the room feel thick and wrong. It was a low, scraping, hissing sound. Not fast, not sudden like a snake. It was a slow, agonizing slide of sound, like something enormous, something wet and heavy was being slowly drawn over a coarse surface. It lasted maybe 5 or 6 seconds, and the sound seemed to move too, traveling slowly up the bedroom wall and then across the ceiling. And then a tiny, almost inaudible sigh, like a sound of relief, and then the long, deep silence. It was the sound of a breath, a massive, slow, deeply labored breath. It happened again a minute later. Thump, thump. Then the slow, terrifying hiss, scrape of the air moving, the massive, unseen bellows filling up with whatever it needed to keep going. My book fell onto the carpet with a soft, unnoticed thud. I froze. I was staring at my bedroom wall, the pale blue paint suddenly looking like the skin of something ancient. And in that instant, I felt the terrifying weight of a realization that I should have had 20 years ago. The walls weren't just containing me. They were holding me. The entire structure, every stud, every sheet of drywall, every shingle on the roof was a massive, slow-moving, breathing creature.
The next 3 days I spent in a state of complete, high anxiety. I was walking around the house like a detective in a bad movie. My parents just thought I was acting weird. Home after college, maybe depressed, or maybe just bored. "Are you all right, dear? You're staring at the floorboards again," my mom asked once, pouring herself a cup of coffee and looking at me with gentle concern. I just mumbled something about needing to find a contact lens I'd dropped a few days ago. I couldn't tell them the truth. How do you tell your parents, the people who work hard to pay the bills, that their beautiful, comfortable, tax-assessed house is a living, breathing, giant thing? You don't. They'd think I needed a doctor or maybe a full-on intervention. My investigation started in the basement. Basements are always the darkest, dampest, most unsettling part of any house, no matter how clean they are. Ours was unfinished, just concrete, full of boxes of old Christmas decorations and tools, and a smell that was a mix of dry dirt and mildew. I went down there with the brightest flashlight I could find, a heavy-duty camping light. I was looking for anything. A broken pipe that was releasing air in a slow rhythm, a malfunctioning humidifier on a weird timer, a loose piece of wood resting on the furnace that might rattle in a rhythmic way. I checked the pipes. I tapped the walls, hoping to hear a hollow spot. I even got down on my hands and knees, getting dust on my clothes, and looked into the dark, dusty crawl space under the lowest level. I spent over an hour down there, shining my light into every corner. The air was cold and heavy. I kept expecting to see something, anything, a logical, mundane explanation that would bring me back to reality. A massive industrial fan on a slow timer, perhaps. A hidden vent I'd never noticed. A huge piece of machinery that had been sitting there forever. But there was nothing. Just concrete, dust, boxes, and the silence. And then, as I was about to climb the wooden stairs back up, I heard it again. But this time it was muffled by the thick concrete floor and the cold stone walls. It was a deep, resonating boom-oomph. It was so low, so profound, that I felt it not in my ears, but in my chest, right behind my ribs. It felt like a low-frequency bass that just hits you right in the sternum.
And I realized the sound wasn't coming from the basement. It was coming from below the basement, from the earth. The house was just the shell, the massive wooden rib cage that was transmitting the sound. I backed up the stairs slowly, one step at a time, my eyes locked on the spot where the wall met the concrete floor. I felt a cold dread, a primal, ancient fear that goes way beyond cheesy ghost stories and fictional monsters. This was the fear of the physical world itself being fundamentally wrong.
I started obsessing over it. I couldn't sleep a wink. I would sit on the living room sofa all night, just waiting for the rhythm. I started timing it with the stopwatch on my phone. The cycle was always the same. Thump-thump, the start of the inhale, followed by 45 to 50 seconds of total, heavy silence. Then the slow, wet hiss, scrape, the actual inhalation, lasting maybe 7 to 10 seconds, the sound traveling up the walls around me. Then another pause of about 30 seconds, and then the final, deep, almost subterranean boo, the exhale. The full cycle was just under 2 minutes long, every single time. Every 2 minutes, the house took a breath. Every 2 minutes, the foundation shifted, the walls strained, and the roof tiles settled a fraction of an inch as the massive, unseen thing below it drew a breath. I started mapping it in my mind. The old rusty vent on the side of the house, the one that never seemed to have a function. Maybe that was a nostril. The loud creak in the hallway floor, the one that everyone just called the old house sound. Maybe that was a joint or a ligament shifting under the weight. The whole place, this innocent-looking colonial, was a bizarre, dormant leviathan. I tried to find other people who felt it. I searched old town records, property deeds, and local history archives. Was the house built on something? An old mine? A natural spring? Was there some local folklore? I found nothing. The house was built in 1957 by a simple contractor named Arthur Jenkins. He lived in the house until he died 40 years later. No strange incidents, no weird stories. Just a normal life. Lived in a house that was quietly, patiently breathing around him the whole time. The thought of Mr. Jenkins watching TV, eating dinner, going to sleep, completely oblivious that he was living inside a massive lung, was horrifying. I started to focus on the moments when the breathing got irregular. This was the absolute worst part of the whole experience, the thing that broke my sanity. Most of the time it was the steady, slow 2-minute beat, but sometimes when the weather was rough, or maybe when a heavy garbage truck drove down the street and shook the house, the rhythm would completely break. It would get shallow, fast, almost panicked. One afternoon there was a huge thunderstorm, the kind when the wind is whipping around the house like a wild animal, and rain is hitting the windows like handfuls of gravel, and the power flickers constantly, almost going out but never quite. I was sitting at the kitchen table watching the storm, and that's when it happened. The house started to pant.
Instead of the slow 2-minute cycle, it sped up dramatically. Thump, thump, thump. Short, shallow, fast. The wet scraping inhale wasn't a slow hiss anymore. It was a quick, sharp sh sound, like rapid, desperate, shallow breaths. The whole house felt like it was hyperventilating, struggling for air. The floorboards vibrated under my feet. The windows rattled violently, not just from the wind outside, but from an internal tremor, a desperate shake. It was in distress, and I realized with a jolt of pure cold terror that the house wasn't just breathing near me. It was reacting to the storm. It was feeling fear. I remember covering my ears, crouching down on the kitchen chair, trying to make myself small and quiet, like if I was silent enough, the thing wouldn't notice me.
I felt like a tiny insect crawling around inside the shell of a giant animal caught in a trap. The panic breaths lasted for 10 solid minutes, a constant, sickening rhythm of fear until the worst of the storm passed. And then, with one final long, shuddering gasp that felt like the earth itself was sighing, the house went back to its slow, measured 2-minute cycle. I knew then I had to leave. The house wasn't just a physical place, it was a conscious being, trapped and suffering, and I was sharing its misery. The thought of my parents living their lives here, still completely oblivious, was a constant heavy weight. But I couldn't tell them. I couldn't shatter their reality and their comfort, not after all those years. I had to investigate one last thing before I could walk away forever. I needed to see where the sound was coming from, not the general direction, but the actual physical source. I needed to look the monster in the mouth. The most terrifying sound, the one that accompanied the wet hiss-scrape of the inhale, always seemed loudest in the center of the living room, near the old brick fireplace. The fireplace was unused. It had been boarded up with plaster and drywall 50 years ago, probably to save on heating costs. I decided that was the key. That was the place where the house's voice was loudest. Late that night, I went downstairs. It was 3:15 a.m. I was armed with a heavy crowbar, a big flashlight, and a terrible shaking fear that made my teeth chatter. The house was deep into its slow 2-minute breathing pattern. Thump, thump. Silence. I started prying at the drywall that covered the old hearth. The noise of the crowbar grating against the plaster was deafeningly loud in the silence of the night. It felt like I was destroying the house, hurting it, and I was worried I'd wake my parents, but the fear of what I would find now outweighed that immediate normal concern. I pulled off a small piece of the wall, and behind it was the original stone fireplace, and a hole. Not a natural hole, not a crack in the brickwork. This was a man-made hole, a perfect circle about the size of a dinner plate, bored straight into the stone of the hearth, right where the chimney flue should have been. It was filled with old, yellowed, damp insulation, the kind that looks like old cotton batting. I reached in, my fingers trembling so badly I could barely control them, and pulled out a handful of the wet, disgusting batting. And I saw it. The hole didn't lead up the chimney to the roof. It led down. It was a perfectly black void, dropping into what looked like an air pocket, a vast, dark gap between the stone foundation and the raw earth below. And as I stared into that absolute perfect blackness, the 2-minute cycle hit its inhalation phase. The wet hiss-scrape sound was now roaring. It was so loud it was physically painful, a wave of sound pressure that hit my face. And I finally saw why it sounded wet. The hole was acting like a massive, focused air intake. As the earth below the house drew in its massive breath, the air was being sucked through this opening, pulling with it not just air, but something else. Something dark. A fine mist of black, earthy particulate, like powdered soil or pulverized stone, was being drawn up from the darkness of the hole, coating the edges of the fireplace stone like a fine black dew. It was like watching a lung draw in the very dust and dirt of the world, feeding on the earth itself. And then, as the inhalation finished and the 2-minute silence began, I heard a new sound. The sound that pushed me over the edge and into pure, screaming flight. It was a sound that came from the hole, a sound that should not exist in any house on earth. It was a faint, clicking, chittering noise, like 100 tiny, sharp pieces of rock grinding against each other, the sound of a jaw that was made of pure stone. It wasn't a human sound, not an animal sound. It was the sound of geology being alive, the sound of the massive breathing thing below me having internal moving parts. It was the sound of its teeth.
I scrambled back, dropping the crowbar onto the wooden floor with a clatter. I didn't care about the noise. The fear of my parents waking up was completely gone. All that existed was the cold, silent horror of the open black mouth in the wall of my house. The house was breathing, and in that breath, I heard the sound of something chewing. The house took its next breath. This time, the exhale was different. The boom-oomph that always accompanied the exhale felt closer, more violent, like a deliberate sigh of annoyance, a massive, conscious push of air. And as it exhaled, I saw a thin, gray smoke, like vaporized dust and dirt, puff out of the hole in the fireplace. A tiny, silent cloud. It was the house seeing me. The house was aware that its little secret, its breathing hole, had been uncovered. It knew I was there. I didn't think about packing a bag. I didn't think about my parents. I just ran. I ran up the stairs, grabbed my car keys off my dresser, and kept moving. I didn't even put on a jacket or shoes. I ran past my parents' closed bedroom door, and I heard the thump-thump of the next inhale cycle start. But this time, it was faster. It was a chase rhythm. I threw the front door open, the wood scraping against the frame like a massive, protesting groan, and I ran out onto the lawn, the cold grass wet under my bare feet into the cold, silent night air. I looked back at the house, bathed in the pale light of the porch lamp. It looked completely normal. Faded yellow siding, slanted porch, the big maple tree. But I knew that behind those walls, in the pitch-black basement, in the damp, lonely earth, was a thing that breathed. A thing that had been my silent, gigantic roommate my entire life.
I got into my car and started the engine, and as the headlights swept across the house one last time, I saw it. The window of my old bedroom, the one I had just fled from, was open a crack, and as the house finished its next quick, angry inhalation, the sheer vacuum of the breath caused the thin, faded blue curtains in my bedroom to billow inward into the darkness of the room, as if being sucked toward a black, hungry center. It wasn't the wind. There was no wind. It was the house drawing me back in. I floored the gas pedal and drove away, not slowing down until the entire town was a small, quiet memory in my rearview mirror. I pulled over at a rest stop hundreds of miles away. I looked at the dark number on my phone, 3:47 a.m. The house was still breathing. It would always be breathing, and I was finally outside of its monstrous, slow, rhythmic life. I never went back. I called my parents a week later and told them I got a job offer that started immediately, that I couldn't make it back to say goodbye properly. They were disappointed, but they understood. I didn't tell them the truth. I couldn't. They're still there, living inside the rib cage of that thing, and I'm outside, trying to forget the sound of the wet, scraping inhale. Sometimes, late at night, in my new quiet apartment, I hear a radiator hiss or a floorboard creak, and my blood runs cold, because I know the difference now. I know the sound of a house settling, and I know the sound of a house living, and the knowledge is a poison you can never clean out of your memory. The horror wasn't the ghost. The horror was the reality. The world is far stranger and more monstrous than we let ourselves believe, and the places we call home can be the biggest monsters of all. I escaped its walls, but I don't think I'd ever escaped its slow, 2-minute beat in my head.
Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story.